Hey guys, tonight we're going to drift into something a little quieter, a little more ordinary, but somehow no less strange. Farming. Not the exciting kind, not tractors and John Deere commercials. No, I'm talking about medieval farming. You know, mud, wheat, pigs, and that suspicious neighbor who accidentally lets his goats eat your oats. So if you're already in bed, perfect. If you're not, close the curtains, switch off the buzzing lights, and maybe keep just one candle glowing. Tonight we're going to walk through the furrows of medieval fields, slowly, sleepily, because somehow this is the story of survival, nobility, and a whole lot of manure. Now farming may sound boring, and in many ways it was, which is exactly why it's perfect bedtime material. Nobody is going to wake up in a panic because a medieval peasant planted rye instead of barley, unless you were the peasant. And then, yeah, your family starves. So, high stakes for them, not for us. Let's settle in. The medieval world was built on farming. Castles get all the fame. Knights, tournaments, shiny swords, that's the stuff we put in video games, but none of that mattered if the peasants didn't grow enough turnips. And turnips are not exactly heroic. Nobody writes an epic poem about Sir Reginald the turnip farmer, though maybe they should have. The truth is, 90% of people in the Middle Ages were farmers. That means the kings and queens we obsess over, they were sitting on a pyramid made of cabbages. And when the harvest failed, everything failed. Armies starved, cities emptied, even monasteries got grumpy because, surprise, the monks needed bread too. And the bread, oh the bread. Imagine eating bread every day, but not the soft, fluffy kind you get from a bakery. No, medieval bread was dense, heavy, sometimes mixed with beans or peas to stretch the flour, sometimes made with rye that went moldy, and sometimes, just for fun, it got infected with ergot fungus, which meant that one bite of your morning toast could turn into a hallucinatory trip. Imagine trying to plow a field while your bread is giving you visions of demons. Sleepy. And a little awkward. But let's slow down. Let's talk about the rhythm. Farming was the clock of medieval life. The church bells rang, sure, but the real calendar was soil. You plowed in spring, you sowed in autumn. You prayed the winter wasn't brutal. That was it. Life measured in furrows and seed sacks. Of course, this wasn't modern farming. Medieval peasants didn't have tractors, they had oxen. And oxen are basically very large, very stubborn cows with a bad attitude. The plow itself was heavy, so heavy that in Northern Europe, where the soil was thick and sticky, a single farmer could not manage it alone. You needed a team, sometimes 8 oxen lined up like a medieval tractor, and your neighbors, because let's face it, nobody owned 8 oxen unless they were rich, so farmers shared. And then they argued, whose oxen were stronger, whose field deserved to be plowed first. The gossip must have been exhausting. Then came the open field system. This was classic medieval socialism, but without the politics. Everyone in the village shared one giant field, but instead of just one crop, the land was cut into long strips. Imagine an enormous chocolate bar snapped into thin rectangles. Each family got a strip here, another one way over there, and a third strip in some inconvenient spot near the marsh. Why not give people their land in one place? Because that would be logical. And medieval farming was not logical. And speaking of logic, let's talk about the 3-field system. It sounds impressive, like some medieval innovation that changed everything. And actually it sort of did. Instead of farming one big field until it died, they rotated. 1 year wheat, the next year barley, the third year nothing, just grass, weeds, and sheep wandering through. That nothing was called fallow, which basically meant we're giving up this year, but the soil needs a nap. Fair enough. Everyone was tired in the Middle Ages. This system improved yields, which meant more food, which meant more children survived, which meant more peasants, which meant more farming. The cycle was endless. You can almost hear the yawns. But medieval farming wasn't just about fields. It was about people, and people are messy. Peasants lived in small villages, clusters of wooden huts, usually with a church at the center. Houses were smoky, floors were dirt, and pigs often shared the space. Yes, Pigs, you might roll over in your sleep and oops, there's a hog staring at you. Not very romantic, unless you're the pig. The lord of the manor, of course, owned the land. He didn't farm it, that would be beneath him. Instead, peasants did the work. In return, they paid rent, sometimes in money, more often in crops or labor. So if the lord wanted his fields harvested, peasants had to help, even if their own fields were desperate for attention. Picture this, your barley is about to rot in the rain, but you're stuck harvesting the lord's oats. Not a great system, unless you were the lord, then it was fantastic. And the church, oh yes, the church took its cut too. 1/10 of everything. It was called the tithe. Imagine working 12-hour days, bent over with a sickle, only to hand over 1/10 of your grain to a monk who politely reminds you it's for your soul. Convenient, right? Of course, disasters happened. Too much rain meant crops drowned. Too little rain meant crops withered. A cold snap in June could ruin the entire harvest. And when the harvest failed, famine arrived. People ate acorns, bark, cats, and yes, sometimes each other, which is not very bedtime friendly, so we'll move past that quickly. But let's not forget the weird traditions. For example, in some villages, the first plowing of the season was treated like a festival. People decorated the plow with flowers. They sang, they drank, because apparently the only way to make plowing tolerable was beer, which honestly is still true for many farmers today. And beer, let's pause there. Medieval people drank beer like water because water was suspicious. Streams were full of waste. Wells went bad, beer was safer. It was weak, yes, but it was everywhere. Children drank it, farmers drank it, even monks drank it. In fact, monks became expert brewers. Picture a fat monk in sandals humming a hymn while stirring a vat of barley mash. The Middle Ages in one image. So what does all this mean? Well, it means that behind the castles, the crusades, the royal weddings, the endless wars, behind all of that were farmers. Tired, muddy, half-starved farmers. The medieval world depended on them, but their reward, they lived short, exhausting lives. And then they died, usually before 50. Let's drift off to another farming detail. The tools, sickles, scythes, wooden plows tipped with iron, simple, slow, designed to break your back. Shoes weren't common, gloves, forget it. Your hands became leather, your spine curved. You lived outside, bent to the soil. Medieval farming was not poetry, it was sweat. And if you were lucky, your sweat turned into bread. But somehow out of this mud, out of this endless cycle of planting and harvesting came society. Towns grew, markets flourished, cathedrals rose, kings taxed. And all of it, every brick and stone, every sword and chalice was bought by farming. The peasants didn't know they were building Europe. They were just trying to make enough bread to survive winter. But without them, the lords had no feasts. The kings had no armies. The popes had no churches. So tonight, while we lie in bed, drifting slowly into sleep, maybe give a little nod to those medieval farmers. Because while their lives were full of mud and monotony, they carried the entire Middle Ages on their blistered shoulders. And they didn't even get a thank you. All right, we're back in the mud. Still medieval, still farming, still peasants looking tired. If part 1 was about the basics, the fields, the bread, the oxen, then part 2, well, let's move a little deeper into the rhythms of the year. Because medieval farming wasn't just random plowing and hopping for the best. It was seasonal, and the seasons ruled everything. Imagine waking up, not to an alarm clock, but to the sound of roosters, the smell of smoke from your neighbor's hut, and the uncomfortable awareness that if you don't get out into the fields, your family might literally starve by winter. Talk about motivation. Spring was when life returned, and by life, I mean mud. Everything was wet. Fields turned into sludge pits, but this was the time for plowing, harrowing, and sowing. Men, women, children, everybody worked. Even grandma might hobble out to scatter seed because more hands meant survival. The plow itself left behind those long, even furrows, rows carved into the soil, and peasants liked straight furrows. A crooked line was basically public shame. Everyone in the village could see it. Your neighbor would laugh. maybe even whisper about how your oxen were drunk. Seeds were scattered by hand, which sounds easy, but it was. The trick was to throw evenly, like some medieval version of lawn care. Too heavy and the seeds clumped, too light and nothing grew. If you were bad at it, well, everyone noticed. And they probably sighed at you, which was worse than any punishment. By summer, crops grew tall, wheat, barley, oats. But don't picture golden fields swaying romantically in the wind. More like half-baked stalks, constantly threatened by pests, storms, or the neighbor's goats. Farmers weeded constantly. They scared off birds. They repaired fences. And of course, they prayed. Medieval farming had a lot of prayer. Because when you have no pesticides and no irrigation, your best option is appealing to a higher power. This was also hay season. Meadows were cut, dried, and stacked for winter fodder. Without hay, livestock starved. Without livestock, no manure. Without manure, no crops. The medieval ecosystem was basically a giant loop of mud, grass, and cow dung, poetic in its own way. Our autumn harvest, the most important time of year. Villages buzzed with activity. Crops were cut with sickles, curved little knives that turned harvesting into hours of bending and slicing. Some peasants used scythes, but sickles were more common. The grain was bundled into sheaves, carried on backs, and stacked into ricks. You could almost hear the groans of peasants everywhere, hunched under heavy loads, dreaming of bread. Harvest was exhausting, but it was also communal. Everyone worked together, singing dull songs, sometimes even competing over who could cut faster. The Lord's fields were harvested first, of course, then the church's share, then finally your own. By the time you got to your grain, you were probably too tired to celebrate. Winter was bleak, fields rested, farmers didn't. They repaired tools, they mended roofs, they slaughtered animals they couldn't feed. The smokehouses filled with salted meat. Families huddled around smoky fires, telling stories, hoping the food lasted until spring. If it didn't, you stretched your flour, mixed it with acorns, or prayed your neighbor had pity. Spoiler, neighbors rarely had pity. And so the year rolled on, over and over. Spring, summer, autumn, winter, furrows, harvests, prayers, hunger. It sounds monotonous. It was monotonous, but it was also everything. Now let's wander sideways for a moment, because farming wasn't just practical, it was spiritual. Peasants believed the land itself had moods. Spirits lived in fields, in rivers, in forests. There were rituals for fertility, for rain, for protection against pests. And while the church tried to stamp out pagan customs, let's be honest, they never fully succeeded. For example, in some places, the last sheaf of wheat harvested wasn't just grain. It was sacred. They called it the corn spirit. You couldn't just throw it to the pigs. You tied it up, decorated it, maybe even dressed it like a doll. Because in that sheaf lived the spirit of the harvest. Treat it well, and next year would be bountiful. Treat it poorly, and well, expect famine. Was this logical? Not really. But then again, medieval farming was mostly praying and guessing. So why not add some superstition for good measure? And speaking of guessing, let's talk about medieval weather forecasting. Spoiler, it was terrible. Farmers looked at the sky, the birds, maybe the wind. They had proverbs like red sky at night, shepherd's delight, which sounds poetic but wasn't exactly science. Still, it gave them comfort. And honestly, in a world where frost could kill your wheat overnight, comfort mattered. But farming wasn't just peasants. Lords loved to pretend they were farmers too. Picture a nobleman sitting in his stone manor, wearing velvet, talking about his land. Did he actually plow? Of course not. But he liked the idea of being a wise steward. Medieval manuals were written for noble landowners, with detailed advice on crop rotations, soil fertility, and livestock care. Did the lords read them? Sometimes. Did they follow the advice? Almost never. Why bother when peasants had no choice but to do the work anyway? Yet oddly enough, some aristocrats were obsessed with farming details. There are records of kings debating the merits of barley over wheat. Monks, too, wrote long treatises about sheep breeding. And let's not forget, monasteries owned vast estates. In many ways, monks were Europe's corporate farmers. silent, bald-headed CEOs of grain. Let's wander again into livestock, because medieval farming wasn't just about grain. Cows, pigs, sheep, chickens, they were essential. Cows gave milk, sometimes meat, always manure. Oxen, as we mentioned, pulled plows, and oxen were not glamorous animals. Slow, stubborn, drooling, yet they were the backbone of agriculture. Without oxen, no fields. Without fields, no bread. And without bread, no peasants. Sheep were gold. Literally, their wool drove the medieval economy. England in particular became rich from sheep. There's a saying that the wealth of England rested on the back of a sheep, which is not exactly flattering for a nation, but true. Wool fed the textile trade, which fed the merchants, which fed the kings. Pigs, meanwhile, were the garbage collectors. They ate scraps, roots, acorns, then they turned into bacon, efficient. Chickens provided eggs, goats gave milk. Horses, they were rare for peasants, too expensive. Lords had them, knights had them, but the average farmer stuck with oxen. Horses were fast, yes, but oxen could pull all day without complaining. Well, they still complained, but in a cow sort of way. And then there were taxes, because of course there were. Farming meant producing food, and producing food meant being taxed. Lords demanded rents. The church demanded tithes. Kings demanded levies. Everyone wanted a slice, which left peasants with crumbs. Take England after the Norman conquest. William the Conqueror created the Domesday Book. Basically, a giant inventory of who owned what down to the last cow. It was the medieval IRS. Farmers were counted, fields measured, livestock recorded. You couldn't hide your pig. The king knew about it, and if he wanted a tax on pigs, guess what you paid? So what was daily life like really? Imagine it. You wake up early, maybe still half asleep on a straw bed, the smell of smoke and animals in your nostrils. You grab a chunk of bread, maybe some ale. Then it's out to the fields, all day bending, weeding, hoeing. Maybe the sun bakes you, maybe rain soaks you. Either way, you keep going. Lunch, another chunk of bread. Maybe an onion. Dinner, surprise, it's bread again. With peas, if you're lucky, a bit of bacon. By evening, you're exhausted. You shuffle back into your hut, where your family, pigs, and maybe a chicken or two are waiting. You sit by the fire. Someone tells a story about a saint, or maybe about the neighbor who saw a ghost. You drink weak beer, you collapse, and tomorrow you do it again. It's monotonous, but it's steady, and in its own muddy way, it's soothing. And so, as we drift off tonight, picture those medieval fields. Long, open strips of grain, oxen plodding slowly, farmers bent over, hands rough, faces weathered, a world of cycles, of seasons, of hunger and hope, a world built not on knights or castles, but on soil, always soil. Let's drift now toward another detail of farming life, the odd customs, the rituals, the little eccentricities that made peasant life both dull and strangely human. But we'll save that for the next part. So we've seen the peasants slogging through mud. We've seen oxen plodding, monks brewing, lords pretending they understood agriculture. But farming wasn't just soil and sweat. It was also ritual, superstition, the little oddities that made life feel like more than endless bread and back pain. Because when you live on the edge of starvation, every stalk of grain feels magical. And if you're not entirely sure why the sun shines or the rain falls, well, you invent reasons. In many villages, the very first plowing of the year wasn't just work, it was ceremony. The plow might be decorated with flowers, ribbons, or even bits of bread, because nothing says blessing the land like tying carbs to your oxen. Villagers gathered, priests mumbled prayers, maybe sprinkled holy water. Sometimes a woman or even a child was placed on the plow and dragged a few feet, because apparently this guaranteed fertility. Nobody asked the child if they wanted to. It was half Christian, half pagan, and fully exhausting, but it made people feel better. And in a world where one bad harvest could mean death, feeling better mattered almost as much as actual farming. Now the last sheaf of wheat harvested each autumn was sacred. In England, they sometimes called it the neck or the mare. In Germany, it was tied up, dressed, maybe even carried home like a baby. Some villages kept it until spring, when they plowed again, to return the spirit of the grain to the soil. Others baked it into a special loaf and gave it to the Lord. Of course, sometimes the Lord didn't appreciate the symbolism. Imagine toiling for months, cutting and binding wheat, then carrying a carefully braided sheaf to your noble, only for him to nod once and feed it to his horse. Very motivating. Ah yes, dancing. After harvest, peasants were exhausted, sore and half-starved. Naturally, the solution was to dance, because why not double down on exhaustion? Fiddles, flutes, drums, whatever instruments were lying around were brought out, and the whole village stomped around in circles. It was messy, it was noisy, and it was a way of saying, we survived, barely. Sometimes these dances went on for days. Beer flowed, bread was shared, and occasionally someone got into a fight over a missing chicken, which, in medieval terms, was basically a bar brawl. In some regions, especially in England, there was a quirky little holiday called Plow Monday. This was the first Monday after Epiphany in January. Villagers paraded a plow through the streets, decorated with ribbons, while men, often dressed as women, because apparently that was always funny, asked for money. If you didn't pay, they threatened to plow up your doorstep, a very polite form of extortion. It was both celebration and fundraising, and probably a good excuse to drink in the middle of winter, because if there's one constant in medieval farming, it's beer. We all know scarecrows, but in the Middle Ages, people used some creative methods to scare birds. One common trick was tying animal skulls, usually horses, on poles in the fields, because nothing says stay away crows like a rotting horse head grinning from the rye. Effective, maybe nightmarish, definitely. In other places, children were sent into fields to clap, shout, and wave sticks. Congratulations, you've just invented medieval babysitting. And while we're on weird details, let's talk about fertility rituals, because of course, farming is about fertility, and medieval people had endless rituals to encourage it. Some believed sleeping with your plow in the field, yes, literally dragging your bed into the furrows, would guarantee a good harvest. Others thought sprinkling milk, ale, or even blood on the soil would feed it. The logic was simple. If you feed the ground, it feeds you back, which is sweet. Until you realize it meant wasting perfectly good beer. But farming rituals weren't all cheerful. Sometimes they were desperate. Take droughts. When rain didn't come, villagers held processions. They marched with crosses, saints' relics, maybe even dragged statues of the Virgin Mary into the fields, begging for clouds. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. And sometimes, in a particularly dark mood, the villagers decided someone must have cursed the crops, which is how you end up with witch trials. Of course, most of the time, it wasn't witches. It was just weather, but telling peasants it's just weather while their fields shriveled wasn't exactly comforting. So instead, they blamed the cranky old woman who lived by the woods. History is not kind. Now let's pause and drift into the soundscape of medieval farming. Close your eyes, picture it, oxen snorting, the rhythmic thud of a flail beating grain, the hiss of sickles slicing stalks, children chasing crows, dogs barking at pigs, and in the background the dull toll of the church bell reminding you that, yes, the church is still taking 1/10 of everything you're working for. Lovely. But rituals and sounds aside, there was also fashion, farming fashion, which, spoiler, was not glamorous. Peasants wore rough wool or linen tunics, brown, grey, maybe faded red if they were lucky. Men wore hose and leather shoes, though shoes wore out fast. Women wore long dresses, aprons and kerchiefs, and everyone was perpetually dirty. No deodorant, no showers, just smoke, sweat and mud. A charming mix. Sometimes during festivals, peasants wore flower crowns or ribbons, which must have looked adorable for about 10 minutes until sweat and dust ruined everything. But for that brief moment, farming life looked almost picturesque. Almost. And then there was the social side of farming. Villages weren't isolated. They were communities. Everyone knew everyone, and gossip was the national sport. Who sowed late, who harvested too early, who had lazy oxen, who owed rent. Farming wasn't just about soil, it was about reputation. For example, if your strip of land produced weak crops year after year, people talked. Maybe you weren't weeding enough. Maybe your wife was lazy. Maybe God was punishing you. The village noticed everything. Privacy was not a medieval concept. And of course, lords noticed too. Lords kept track of how much rent was paid, how much grain came in. A bad harvest might earn sympathy, or it might earn fines, because nothing says we care like charging people for starving. But perhaps the strangest thing about medieval farming was how fragile it all was. One bad year could ruin a family, 2 bad years could ruin a village, and 3 bad years, that was famine. Entire regions depopulated, skeletons in the fields, silence where there should have been flutes and dances. The Great Famine of 1315–1317 was the worst example. Rain fell and fell and fell, crops rotted, livestock drowned, grain prices skyrocketed, people ate dogs, cats, even leather. In some places they dug up gravel, it was bleak, and yet somehow farming went on because it had to. So when we think about medieval farming, it's easy to laugh at the weird rituals, the flower-decked plows, the horse-skull scarecrows. But beneath the humor was fear. Fear that nature wouldn't provide. Fear that God wasn't listening. Fear that hunger would return. And those fears shaped an entire civilization. And as we drift off now, maybe picture this. A cold autumn evening, the harvest finished. A village gathered around fires. Children nibbling crusts of bread. Men drinking ale, women mending clothes. The air filled with smoke and laughter. The fields outside dark and silent, waiting for next spring. The cycle complete, for now. Sleepy, steady, endless farming. And in our next wander, we'll step into the tangled relationship between peasants and their lords. Because if farming was mud and sweat, it was also politics. Who owned the land? Who owed the labor? Who ate the bread? Spoiler, usually not the ones who grew it. So let's be honest. Medieval farming wasn't just about seeds and oxen. It was about power. Because land was wealth, and wealth was power, and power trickled down very unevenly. Or more accurately, it dripped down like muddy water, leaving the peasants wet and miserable while the lords stayed dry. Every medieval village lived under the shadow of the manor. The manor wasn't just a big house. It was the entire system. A lord, usually some minor noble with a bad haircut and a long genealogy, technically owned all the land. Peasants worked it, and in return, they got to live. Sounds generous, right? Serfdom. Now here's the thing, not all peasants were serfs. Some were free tenants. They paid rent in money or crops and they had a little wiggle room. But serfs were stuck, bound to the land, couldn't leave without permission, couldn't marry outside the village without paying a fine, couldn't even bake bread in their own oven sometimes because the lord had a monopoly on ovens. Yes, ovens. Imagine being charged to use the village oven while your lord sits there eating roasted goose. Serfs owed labor too. A few days each week, they had to work the lord's fields, plowing, sowing, harvesting, not for themselves, but for him. That meant their own crops often came second. Picture your barley drooping in the rain while you're stuck hauling hay for the manor. It's the kind of thing that makes you mutter very medieval curse words. The manor court. And just in case peasants forgot their place, there was the manor court, a lovely little gathering where the lord or his steward handed out justice. Someone's cow trampled your oats, court. Someone stole a chicken, court. Someone brewed beer without permission, court. The fines added up. A broken fence, a late rent, even gossip could get you fined. And who received the money? The lord, of course. It was a system designed to squeeze peasants like a damp rag until every last drop of grain and coin dribbled out. The rights of lords. Lords also claimed special rights. For example, milling grain. Peasants weren't allowed to grind their wheat at home. They had to bring it to the Lord's mill, pay a fee, and receive flour in return. Convenient for the Lord, less so for the family who just wanted bread without extra taxes. Same with wine presses, same with ovens, same with fish ponds. Lords turned daily necessities into toll booths. Every step of a peasant's life passed through a gate that cost something. A few pennies here, a sack of oats there. Slowly, steadily, it drained. And yet here's the ironic part. Lords depended on peasants entirely. The grand feasts, the castles, the shiny armor, they were all built on peasant backs. Lords loved to posture about honor and bloodlines, but without farmers, they'd be chewing bark by winter. It's a beautiful contradiction. The people at the bottom kept everyone alive, but got the least out of it. Daily encounters. So what was it like really to live under a lord? Imagine you're a peasant. You spend the morning in the fields, sweating under the sun, and then, just as you're about to collapse, a messenger arrives. The Lord demands labor tomorrow. Harvest his oats. You sigh, nod, and go. Refusal isn't an option. Maybe you see the Lord ride past once in a while, on a fine horse, wearing a fur cloak, followed by hunting dogs. He might nod at you, maybe not. To him, your background scenery, just another bent figure in the fields. And yet sometimes, lords and peasants weren't enemies. Some lords actually protected their tenants, fed them in famine, defended them in court. Others, not so much. It depended entirely on the personality of the man in the manor, which means your survival hinged on whether your lord was generous or greedy. A dangerous gamble. The church's slice. And let's not forget the other master, the church. While the Lord demanded rent, the church demanded tithes, 1/10 of everything. Grain, hay, pigs, even honey. Priests weren't always popular. After all, they took food while preaching humility. But religion offered hope, and hope was valuable. Peasants knelt in smoky churches, praying for rain or sun, hoping their grain spirits survived the winter. The church told them suffering was holy, which is a nice way of saying, your hunger doesn't matter now, you'll get a reward later. Comforting, if you ignored the fact that the priest was eating roast chicken while saying it. Fines for fun. Let's linger for a moment on fines, because medieval lords invented fines for just about everything. Want to marry? Pay a fine. Want to inherit land? Fine. Want to leave the village? Big fine. One historian once said medieval law was less about justice and more about fundraising. And honestly, that's exactly what it looks like. Peasants must have felt like modern people with subscription fatigue. You pay for bread, you pay for rent, you pay for tithes, and suddenly you realize you're paying a feudal version of Netflix, but with worse content. Resistance. Of course, peasants weren't always passive. They pushed back, sometimes subtly, working slowly on the Lord's land, hiding a pig, brewing beer in secret, and sometimes not so subtly, like the peasants' revolt in England 1381. That was when thousands of fed-up farmers and townsfolk marched on London demanding fairer taxes. For a moment, it looked like the world might turn upside down. Spoiler, it didn't. The king made promises, then broke them. Peasants went home, business as usual. But the fact it happened at all shows the tension. Farming wasn't just labor, it was politics. Every furrow was dug under someone's authority, and sometimes that got heavy enough to break. Irony of nobility. Let's enjoy a little irony here. Lords often called themselves protectors of the land. They loved to describe themselves as stewards of agriculture, yet many had no idea how farming worked. Their knowledge came from manuals written by monks or from watching peasants in the fields, and yet they made all the rules. It's like someone who's never cooked dictating recipes to a chef, but worse, because if the dish turned out badly, you starved. The Lord just blamed the weather. The emotional toll. And what about the peasants themselves? What did it feel like? Imagine the dull frustration. Every day, knowing your work fed someone else more than it fed you. Knowing your children's lives would be just as muddy, just as bound, just as short. That hopeless rhythm seeped into songs, into stories, into the very soil. But peasants also laughed. They told jokes. They danced at harvest festivals. They carved little faces on wooden spoons, probably because they needed something to smile at while eating cabbage for the 100th time. Humor was survival. If you couldn't laugh at the absurdity of working all day for bread you barely got to eat, well, you'd lose your mind. So when we look at medieval farming, it wasn't just toil. It was a social contract, unequal, unfair, sometimes brutal. Lords ruled from their manors, priests preached from their pulpits, kings taxed from afar. And at the bottom, peasants kept digging. They were the foundation, and foundations rarely get monuments. And as we drift off tonight, picture it. The silhouette of a manor house on a hill. Below, the village huts clustered around smoky fires. Beyond, the endless strips of fields, furrowed and waiting. Somewhere in the dark, oxen breathe heavily, and a farmer turns in his straw bed, dreaming of bread he knows he'll never quite taste enough of. Quiet, steady, unfair, but constant. That was medieval farming under the lords. Next, let's wander into the domestic side. The homes, the meals, the marriages, because farming wasn't just work, it was family. And family life, like the soil, could be messy. So you've done your days on the manor fields. You've plowed, you've harvested, you've paid your dues. Now at last, you shuffle back to your house. Not a cottage in the Instagram sense, no cozy thatch with flowers around the door. More like a single smoky room with mud walls, a leaky roof, and the faint smell of turnips that never goes away. Welcome home. Peasant houses. Most peasant homes were one-room huts. Timber frames, walls stuffed with wattle and daub, basically sticks and mud plastered together. The roof, thatched straw, which looked rustic and charming until it caught fire, or until mice moved in. Inside, space was tight. One corner for cooking, one for sleeping, maybe a loft above the animals if you were lucky. Yes, the animals often lived inside the house. Chickens scratching the floor, pigs snorting, a cow tethered in the corner. Why? Because they provided warmth in winter, which sounds cute until you remember the smell. Imagine trying to sleep while your cow sighs in your ear. The floor wasn't wood, it was dirt, sometimes covered with straw, which had to be changed often, or else it turned into something resembling a swamp. Medieval hygiene wasn't winning any awards. Furniture. As for furniture, don't expect much. A bench, maybe a rough table. Beds, if you could call them that, were wooden frames stuffed with straw. No pillows, just a sack of chaff. Families often shared them, huddled together for warmth. Privacy wasn't a thing. You lived, ate, argued, and slept within arm's reach of everyone else. And yes, the smoke. Houses didn't have chimneys, not at first, just a hole in the roof. Fires smoldered in the middle of the floor, filling the air. Your eyes watered, your lungs burned, but hey, the house was warm, sort of. Meals. So what did peasants eat? Spoiler, not much variety. Bread was the staple, dark, coarse bread made of rye, barley, or oats. Wheat bread was for the rich. Peasants also ate pottage, a sort of thick stew of whatever you had, cabbage, beans, peas, maybe a bit of bacon if fortune smiled. Most days it was just vegetables and grains boiled into submission. Meat was rare, maybe salted pork, maybe a chicken on a festival day, fish if you lived near rivers. Milk, cheese, and eggs helped fill the gaps. And beer, yes, beer was safer to drink than water. Children drank it too, though it was weaker than what we imagine today. Flavor, well, let's just say medieval peasant cuisine was exactly Michelin-starred. Salt was precious. Spices, forget it. Those were imported luxuries. Most food tasted earthy, bland, and repetitive, but you ate to survive, not to enjoy. Clothing. Now let's talk fashion, medieval farm edition. Peasant clothes were simple. Tunics for men, long dresses for women. Wool and linen were the main fabrics. Dyed if you were lucky, but usually just plain brown, gray, or off-white. Shoes, sometimes but not always. Leather was expensive. Children often went barefoot, even in chilly weather. Clothes were patched, mended, reused, handed down. You didn't own a closet full of options. You had one or two outfits. That was it. Imagine doing every task, plowing, cooking, hauling water, in the same clothes day after day. Laundry was minimal, which is a polite way of saying people smelled. Family life. But let's step away from the mud and smoke for a moment and look at family life itself. Families were large, lots of children, because many didn't survive. Infant mortality was heartbreakingly high. A third of children might die before age 5. Parents loved their kids, of course, but grief was common, almost routine. You might bury one child and christen another within the same year. Marriages came early. Women often married in their teens, men in their 20s. Courtship wasn't romantic, it was practical. Who had land, who could work, who could provide. The church blessed the union, but economics sealed the deal. Yet despite the hardships, families shared laughter, stories, lullabies. They gathered around fires, told folktales about clever foxes or saints, sang songs while spinning wool. These moments were small, but they mattered. Children. And children weren't just children, they were workers. From the time they could walk, they had chores, herding geese, gathering firewood, watching younger siblings. By the time they hit 10, they were working in the fields. Childhood wasn't a protected bubble, it was an apprenticeship in survival. Still, there was play. Archaeologists have found medieval toys, little wooden horses, carved dolls, even rough balls for games. Kids still laughed, still played tag, still got in trouble for throwing mud. Life was harsh, but never entirely joyless. Health and medicine. Now let's whisper about health. Spoiler, it wasn't good. Peasant diets lacked variety, malnutrition was common, teeth wore down from gritty bread, parasites thrived, cuts got infected, childbirth was dangerous, and the Black Death, when it came, tore through villages like wildfire. Medicine was, well, creative. Remedies involved herbs, charms, sometimes animal parts, a poultice of nettles for arthritis, a sheep's stomach lining for wounds. Some worked a little, most didn't, but when you're desperate, you'll try anything. Festivals and relief. And yet there were bright spots. Festivals broke the monotony. Christmas, Easter, harvest celebrations. The village gathered, feasted, drank, and danced. Music filled the smoky air. Jesters told jokes. Priests grumbled, but everyone needed the release. These festivals weren't just about fun, they were survival too. They gave meaning to the cycle of labor. They reminded peasants that life wasn't only toil, that somewhere, beneath the mud and smoke, there was community. The soundscape. If you want a lullaby tonight, imagine the sounds of a medieval peasant village. The clucking of hens, the creak of a cart, children giggling, a dog barking, the steady ring of a blacksmith's hammer in the distance, the wind sighing over fields. And beneath it all, the low, endless murmur of people surviving together, complaining, laughing, gossiping, singing, a strange, communal symphony of endurance. So yes, medieval farming was toil, but inside those smoky huts, there was also family, love, arguments, jokes, Barbies crying, parents scolding, a stew bubbling on the fire. For every cold, muddy morning, there was also a quiet evening of stories, and that balance, harshness and warmth, struggle and laughter is what made survival possible. Next, let's drift further out again. Beyond the hut, beyond the manor, let's wander into markets and trade, because farming didn't exist in isolation. Grain, wool, cheese, all of it had to move, be sold, be taxed. And that opened a whole other world of fairs, traders, and coins that never seemed to stretch far enough. Every village had some version of a market. Maybe it was just a row of stalls by the churchyard on Sundays. Maybe it was a weekly gathering in the square. Either way, this was the place where farmers turned turnips into coins and coins into everything they couldn't grow. Salt, iron, tools, shoes, maybe even a bright-colored ribbon if you were feeling fancy. Picture it, the noise of bargaining, chickens squawking in baskets, a pig squealing indignantly as someone tugs it through the crowd, women haggling over the price of beans, children darting between legs. The smell, earth, hay, smoked fish, sweat, beer. The market wasn't just economic, it was social. News spread here faster than anywhere. Who was getting married, who was sick, who had quarreled with the miller. Markets were medieval Twitter, minus the hashtags. The great fairs. But beyond the weekly hustle, there were the big fairs, annual or seasonal events that drew traders from far away. Famous fairs in places like Champagne, France, turned sleepy towns into international hubs. Imagine you're a peasant who's never traveled beyond the next village, suddenly standing before stalls bursting with foreign goods. Bright cloth from Flanders, spices from the East, shiny knives, glass beads, even exotic fruits. You'd probably gawk like a medieval tourist, clutching your few pennies tightly, hoping to taste a piece of the wider world. And of course, the fairs were regulated. Lords or towns took fees from every stall. Someone always made money on the back of trade, and spoiler, it usually wasn't the peasants. Grain and wool. Now if we zoom out a little, we find two heavyweights, grain and wool. Grain was survival, wool was profit. Grain markets mattered because bread mattered. Towns needed steady supplies, and rural farmers provided them. Prices rose in bad years, sparking anger and sometimes riots. In good years, surpluses traveled far, down rivers, along cart roads, even across the sea. But wool, that was Europe's gold. English sheep produced some of the finest fleece, and merchants snapped it up for export. Whole landscapes were reshaped for sheep farming. Villages shrank, fields enclosed, all for wool. Peasants muttered, but the money was too good for landlords to resist. A farmer might raise crops for his belly, but his lord was counting on sheep for his purse. Money, money, monies. Let's linger on money for a moment, because it wasn't just coins, it was control. Lords often demanded rent not only in grain, but in cash. That meant peasants had to sell something, somewhere, to scrape together coin, which meant they were tied into the market, whether they liked it or not. Coins were few in circulation. Sometimes peasants paid with goods instead. A chicken in place of silver, a day of labor in place of pennies. Barter never vanished. But over time, money gained power. By the late Middle Ages, even the humblest farmer felt its pull. Of course, coins themselves were confusing. Different lords minted different currencies. Values shifted constantly. You might get paid in pennies from one region, but the miller down the road refused them. Medieval wallets weren't just light, they were chaotic. Merchants and middlemen. And then there were the middlemen, merchants, the guys who turned peasants' sweat into their own fortunes. They bought wool cheap, sold it dear. They stored grain in good years, released it in bad years at inflated prices. Farmers grumbled, but merchants thrived. It's the same story across centuries. Those who controlled distribution often made more than those who produced. A medieval farmer bent over his field might have looked up at a passing merchant's fine cloak and thought, not inaccurately, "That's my work on his back." Taxes and tolls. And don't forget the tolls. Moving goods meant paying tolls on bridges, at town gates, along roads. Every cart of grain stopped again and again, bled dry by fees. Peasants called it robbery with paperwork. Lords called it revenue, same difference. The church's role. The church wasn't absent here either. Monasteries became major players in trade. Monks didn't just pray, they farmed vast estates, brewed beer, raised sheep, ran mills. They were spiritual landlords with very practical business sense, and their barns were often larger than the villagers' houses. The buzz of fairs. But let's drift back for a softer picture. Imagine a medieval fair in the evening, stalls closing down, the air rich with roasted meat and spilled ale, jugglers tossing torches for a few coins, musicians scraping fiddles, farmers laughing, bargaining, maybe drinking more than they should. For one night, life feels lighter. Markets gave rhythm to the year. They were hard work, yes, but also windows into a world larger than the field and hut. A reminder that beyond mud and toil, there were colors, flavors, and voices from distant lands. So farming didn't end at the edge of the field. It spilled into stalls, fairs, warehouses, and ships. Grain and wool tied peasants to kings, sheep to merchants, lords to international trade, all from a furrow in the dirt. Next, let's drift into another layer, the tools and techniques. Because while peasants bent over their fields, they had plows, hoes, scythes, and those tools weren't just wood and iron, they were survival. And sometimes they changed history. The plow was king, and like kings, plows came in two types, the lazy and the serious. The ard or scratch plow was the lazy one, light, easy to drag, basically just a pointed stick with attitude. It scratched the soil but didn't really turn it. Fine for sandy ground, useless on heavy clay. Then came the heavy plow. Now this was the game changer, iron-tipped, with wheels and a mold board to flip the soil. It cut deep, turned heavy earth, made Northern Europe's clay soils suddenly productive. That single upgrade opened whole new regions for farming. You could almost say the heavy plow plowed Europe's way into the Middle Ages. Of course, the downside, it was heavy. You needed a team of oxen to drag it, and oxen were expensive, so villages often pooled resources. Picture 4 farmers squabbling over whose turn it was to use the plow, while the oxen just stood there chewing, unimpressed. Oxen versus horses. Speaking of animals, oxen were the classic draft power, slow, steady, patient. Horses were faster, but they needed better feed, oats, which peasants also needed to eat. A tricky balance. Over time, horses gained ground thanks to better harnesses, which made them more efficient. But oxen never really left. They were the reliable tractors of the medieval world, cheap, stubborn, unglamorous. The scythe and the sickle. Harvest time meant cutting grain, and here the sickle reigned. Small, curved, sharp, perfect for bending low and cutting stalks by hand. Imagine an entire field cut that way, stalk by stalk. It was brutal work. Later, the scythe grew popular, longer, swung in wide arcs, more efficient, less backbreaking, but it came with risks. A careless swing, and suddenly you've trimmed more than grain, not exactly OSHA-approved. The hoe and the spade. Don't overlook the humble hoe. Wooden shaft, iron blade, used for weeding, breaking clods, digging furrows. In some ways, it was the peasant's best friend. Cheap, versatile, always at hand. Spades and shovels, 2 digging ditches, turning compost, shaping irrigation channels. These were the unsung heroes. Nobody sang songs about hoes and spades, but without them, nothing else worked. Water and mills. Water management was huge. Simple ditches guided rain, drained fields, kept crops alive. But when water moved faster, humans got clever. Enter the watermill. Mills ground grain into flour. Before mills, grinding meant hours of hand-turning querns, 2 heavy stones, crushing every meal into aching arms. The watermill changed that. Rivers powered wheels, wheels turned stones, flour poured out. It was efficient, revolutionary. And of course, the Lord usually owned the mill. You paid to use it. Progress, but with a fee. Windmills followed later, catching breezes where rivers didn't flow. Another quiet step toward making farming slightly less miserable. Other tools. Carts creaked along muddy lanes. Forks moved hay. Rakes leveled soil. Harrows smoothed fields after plowing. Nothing fancy, just wood, iron, rope, but every tool chipped a little of the burden away. Blacksmiths mattered too. They sharpened blades, repaired plowshares, shaped nails. Without a village smith, tools dulled fast, and dull tools wasted time. A good blacksmith was almost as valuable as a good harvest. How they used them. Now imagine the rhythm. At dawn, a farmer grips the plow handles, oxen straining ahead, soil turning with every step. Later, his wife bends over rows, hoe in hand, pulling weeds. Children scatter birds from the grain, shouting and waving sticks. Harvest comes, men swing scythes in wide arcs, women follow with sickles, tying sheaves. Everyone, from grandparents to toddlers, plays a role. Tools weren't just objects, they shaped family life, village cooperation, even the calendar. Every sound, from the scrape of a hoe to the rumble of a millstone, was part of the medieval soundtrack. Technology as survival. It's tempting to laugh at how primitive these tools seem, but remember they worked. With them, peasants fed villages, towns, armies, kings. Without them, no castles, no cathedrals, no crusades. The mighty rode on the backs of peasants, and peasants leaned on their plows. And each improvement, the heavy plow, the horse harness, the watermill, nudged society forward. Small changes in iron and wood translated into bigger changes in population, settlement, even politics. Farming tools weren't glamorous, but they were the skeleton of medieval life. So next time you picture medieval history, don't just think knights in armor. Think peasants in fields, gripping worn handles, guiding oxen through mud. Because every battle, every coronation, every grand cathedral, all of it started with someone, somewhere, swinging a hoe. Next, let's drift further into the rhythm of the farming year. Because these tools didn't work randomly, they followed the seasons. Plowing in spring, harvesting in summer, storing in autumn, praying through winter. The cycle was as relentless as it was comforting, and we'll walk through it month by month. The year starts in winter. Cold, grey, quiet, fields lie bare, covered in frost, sometimes snow. Work doesn't vanish, but it slows. You mend tools, patch roofs, sharpen blades, feed the animals with hay stored from summer. Inside smoky huts, women spin wool, weave cloth, repair clothes. Children huddle near the fire. Food grows thin. The bread tastes tougher, the pottage thinner. Everyone hopes the stores last until spring. Winter is the season of patience and worry. Every creak of the roof, every cough of a child reminds you how close survival can be to failure. But winter also brings community, feasts on Christmas, small gatherings, shared fires. You lean on each other because the land is sleeping. Spring turning the earth. Then slowly the ground softens. Birds return, days lengthen. It's time to plow. Oxen strain through the fields, heavy plows turning the soil. Men guide, sweat dripping, while women and children follow with harrows, breaking clumps, smoothing rows. Seeds go in oats, barley, peas, carefully scattered, carefully covered. Too shallow and birds steal them. Too deep and they never sprout. It's a delicate balance. Spring is hope. Every furrow is a gamble with nature. If the rains come, the seeds swell. If frost lingers or drought strikes, the year may be ruined before it even begins. Yet there's excitement too, a sense of beginning again. Summer, work without end. By summer, the fields are green, alive. Crops rise, animals graze, bees hum, but farmers don't rest. Weeding never ends. Pests creep in. Hedges need mending, meadows need mowing for hay. Hay is vital. Without it, animals starve in winter. So families cut, dry, stack it carefully, praying it stays dry. A sudden rain can ruin weeks of labor, leaving mold instead of fodder. Summer is long days in the sun, sweaty backs, scratched hands, dust in your mouth. But it's also the season of growing, when you see the earth's promise, even if it's not yet yours to eat. Autumn, the harvest. Then comes autumn, the climax of the year. Harvest, everyone works. Men, women, children, even the elderly. Sickles cut grain, scythes sweep through stalks, bundles are tied, wagons groan with weight. It's exhausting, frantic work, because grain waits for no one. A storm can flatten fields in a single night, so villages rush, side by side, cutting, binding, hauling. After grain comes threshing, beating stalks to release kernels. Dust fills the air, chaff clings to skin. It's monotonous but necessary, every kernel matters. Autumn is relief, barns fill, bins overflow, bread feels possible again. There are festivals, harvest feasts with music, ale, laughter. For a moment, hunger feels distant. The year has succeeded. Back to winter. And then back to winter. The circle closes, barns grow quiet, tools rest, and the waiting begins again. The human rhythm. Through all this, the rhythm isn't just agricultural, it's human. Births cluster in winter, when couples huddled inside had little else to do. Marriages bloom in spring, new beginnings tied to sowing. Deaths spike in hungry winters or plague summers. The farming year shaped everything: labor, food, love, loss. And the funny thing, despite all the lords and priests, the kings and merchants, it was this rhythm that truly ruled life. Peasants bowed to no calendar but the seasons. The soil was the real monarch, and everyone obeyed. So as you drift tonight, picture it. A quiet January hut, smoke curling up, snow outside. Then the sound of plow blades in April, the hum of bees in July, the swish of sickles in September, and the circle closing once more in December. Over and over, lifetimes measured not in years, but in harvests. Next, let's move into something equally constant: beliefs and superstitions. Because peasants didn't just plant seeds in soil, they planted them in stories. And those stories of saints, spirits, omens, guided farming almost as much as plows did. The church's grip. Officially, the church ran the show. Every farming rhythm came wrapped in blessings. Fields were sprinkled with holy water. Priests blessed seeds before sowing. Rogation days, those processions where villagers marched around the fields chanting prayers, were basically medieval crop insurance. Saints had their specialties too. St. Isidore, the farmer saint, was the big one. People prayed to him for good harvests. Others called on St. Medard against bad weather, or St. Gertrude to keep rats away. The calendar of saints wove neatly into the calendar of farming. And the tithe, always the tithe, 1/10 of your harvest to the church. The priest said it was for God, but you knew it mostly filled the priest's pantry. Still, better to give than risk damnation. Superstitions of the soil. Yet beneath the church's blessings, older beliefs lingered. Farmers watched the sky, the moon, the birds. If crows gathered strangely, it meant storms. If the moon was red, drought was coming. Some signs worked, some didn't, but all gave a sense of control. Charms too. Seeds might be planted with whispered rhymes, sickles blessed with salt to cut clean. A child sent to run through the first furrows for luck. You never really knew if it worked, but could you risk skipping it? Weather lore. Peasants were expert meteorologists without instruments. They read clouds, winds, animal behavior, red sky at night, shepherd's delight. You've probably heard that one, it's medieval. Rainbows, halos around the moon, even the croak of frogs, everything became a forecast. Of course, weather didn't always listen, but the law gave comfort, a way to believe nature followed patterns even when it didn't. Animals and spirits. Fields were alive with invisible company. Spirits of the grain, spirits of the forest, mischievous, unpredictable. Some farmers left offerings, bread, milk, a coin at the edge of the field to keep the unseen content. The last sheaf of harvest often held special meaning. Sometimes it was dressed as a figure, the corn spirit, carried home with ritual, treated with respect. Destroy it carelessly and the spirit might take revenge. Animals carried symbolism too, cats for luck or for witchcraft, depending on the mood. Bees were considered family members. You had to tell them about births and deaths, or they might stop making honey. Farming blurred into folklore at every turn. Witchcraft and fear. And of course, witches, or at least the fear of them. If crops failed mysteriously, if a cow sickened, if hail fell suddenly, whispers began. Maybe old Maron, the widow by the woods, had cursed the field. Maybe someone's evil eye had spoiled the milk. Accusations flared easily. Most farmers didn't actually know why pests swarmed or blight struck. Witchcraft filled the gap. It wasn't just paranoia, it was explanation. Seasonal rituals. The farming year was punctuated by rituals. May Day with flowers and dances to welcome fertility. Harvest feasts with bread baked from the first grain offered to God, or sometimes quietly to older spirits. Winter solstice fires meant to keep darkness at bay. Each ritual balanced the practical with the mystical. You needed rain, so you prayed. You needed fertility, so you danced. Did it change nature? Who knows? But it changed people, gave them unity, courage, and a sense of purpose in a world where the harvest could kill or save you. The blended belief. The truth is, medieval farming beliefs were a messy mix. Christian saints sat comfortably alongside pagan echoes. Holy water sprinkled on fields wasn't so different from older rituals of pouring milk on the soil. People didn't see contradiction, they saw survival. If blessing seeds both in church and at home with a charm gave them a better chance, why not do both? Double the prayers, double the odds. Pragmatism disguised as piety. The human side. And what did it feel like, really? Imagine you're kneeling in your hut at night, muttering a prayer over a sack of grain. You don't know if it will sprout. You don't know if the rain will come. But you whisper anyway because it's something to hold on to. Belief was less about certainty and more about comfort. Children grew up surrounded by it, stories of saints, omens, fairies, curses. They learned which days were lucky, which rituals mattered, and those beliefs sank deep, shaping not just farming but life itself. So farming wasn't just furrows and tools, it was prayers, charms, fears, and rituals. The soil was never empty, it was crowded with saints, spirits, omens. Farmers didn't just plant seeds in dirt, they planted them in faith. Next, let's step into something a little more disruptive, because farming didn't exist in a quiet bubble. Wars, plagues, and taxes constantly crashed into village life, and every sword swing, every outbreak, every coin demanded by a king, it all came back to the fields. Peasant fields were the world's most vulnerable target. Armies needed food, villages had food. You can guess the result. Crops were trampled, barns looted, hay stolen for horses, livestock driven off. Soldiers didn't care if it was your winter bread. Their bellies came first. And war wasn't just between kingdoms. Local lords feuded too. A small quarrel could turn into scorched fields overnight. Villagers never asked for battles, but battles always arrived in their fields. Fortifications of the poor. What could peasants do? Not much. Sometimes they built hidden pits to bury grain, or fled into forests with what they could carry. Some churches doubled as fortresses, stone towers where villagers huddled as soldiers pillaged outside. But mostly, they just endured, watched their year's work go up in smoke, and started again the next spring. Survival became the victory. Taxes and ransom. Even without soldiers, kings squeezed peasants through taxes. War was expensive, so every new campaign meant higher demands: grain, animals, money. If a knight was captured in battle, his ransom came out of the pockets of peasants who had never even seen the battlefield. It was endless: work the land, hand over the grain, watch it feed an army you'd never wanted. Famine's shadow. And then when crops failed or war cut food supply, famine crept in. Imagine fields struck by a cold summer. Wheat shriveled, rye refused to ripen. Barns sat half empty by autumn. By winter, the pottage grew thin, then thinner. Bark, weeds, even ground-up bones found their way into bread. Children's bellies swelled, old people withered. Families rationed scraps day by day. Hunger didn't come fast, it came slow, gnawing, stretching through months until spring returned. And sometimes spring didn't save them. The Great Famine of 1340 15, 1317. One of the worst hit Northern Europe in the early 1300s. Relentless rain drowned crops for years. Grain rotted in the fields. Livestock sickened in the mud. Prices tripled, then quadrupled. People starved in cities and villages alike. Chroniclers wrote of desperate measures, abandoned children, theft, even whispered cannibalism. Whether all those tales are true or not, the suffering was real. Farmers who lived through it never forgot. The Black Death. And then came plague. Mid-14th century, the Black Death rolled across Europe like a storm no one could stop. Whole villages vanished. Crops rotted in unharvested fields because there was no one left to cut them. But oddly, survivors saw strange benefits. With fewer mouths to feed, land stretched further. Labor grew scarce, so wages rose. Peasants found themselves in rare positions of bargaining power. Some even bought their freedom from lords. A grim trade, life for opportunity. Resilience in ruin. Through all of it, war, famine, plague, farming endured, because it had to. Armies needed food, lords needed rents, families needed bread. Even after devastation, seeds were planted again. Picture it: smoke rising from a burned barn, corpses buried hastily after plague, a field trampled by soldiers. And yet, by spring, a farmer still pushed a plow into the soil, because not planting meant certain death. Planting meant maybe survival. That thin thread of maybe was enough. The bitter irony. It's almost funny in a cruel way. Kings and nobles thought they were the movers of history. They fought wars, signed treaties, crowned heirs. But beneath it all, it was always the soil. If peasants planted and harvested, kingdoms lived. If not, kingdoms starved. The plow was as mighty as the sword, only quieter. So as you drift now, think of the field as a battlefield in its own right, not with banners and blood, but with hunger and hope. Every stalk of wheat a survivor of war, every loaf of bread a victory. Next, let's wander into something softer, daily peasant life itself, because farming wasn't just toil and terror. It was meals, songs, marriages, gossip by the well, the quiet heartbeat that carried villages through centuries. Homes were simple, wattle and daub walls, sticks woven, plastered with mud, straw and sometimes dung, roofs thatched with reeds, a single doorway, maybe a small shutter for light, no glass, just openings, drafts everywhere. Inside one room, sometimes two, a fire pit in the center, smoke drifting up through the roof, curling into everyone's eyes. Furniture, rough benches, a table, maybe a chest, straw on the floor for bedding, family, animals and smoke all under one roof. Privacy, forget it. Everyone slept together, parents, children, sometimes even the cow or pig in winter. Cozy if you want to be kind, crowded if you don't. Meals and food. Meals were plain, predictable. Bread was the backbone, dense, coarse, made from rye, barley or oats. Wheat bread was for the rich. Alongside it, pottage, a stew of grains, beans, and whatever vegetables or scraps you had. Carrots, leeks, onions, maybe a little bacon if you were lucky. Meat was rare. Festivals brought pork or beef, but most days it was fish, cheese, or nothing at all. Dairy mattered, milk, butter, curds. Ale was the everyday drink, not strong but safer than water. Children drank it too, everyone did. And don't imagine shiny kitchens. Cooking meant hanging a pot over the fire, stirring with a wooden spoon, and hoping nothing burned. Smoke filled the air, ash clung to everything, but the taste, probably comforting in its earthy, repetitive way. Clothing and appearance. Clothes were simple, practical, wool tunics for men, long wool dresses for women, cloaks against the cold, hoods for rain, shoes, if you had them, leather rough and stiff. Many just went barefoot. Colors were muted, browns, grays, dull greens, bright dyes cost money. Linen undergarments, if you had them, were prized. Washing wasn't frequent. Soap was rare. People smelled of wool, wood smoke, earth. It wasn't glamorous, but no one expected glamour. Work and gender. Men plowed, mowed, chopped wood. Women tended gardens, milked cows, spun wool, baked bread. Both worked the harvest. Children worked too, herding geese, fetching water, scaring birds from fields. Work didn't end at sundown. Chores stretched into evening, mending clothes, weaving, patching roofs. Sleep came early, but not always long. Roosters and church bells woke the village before dawn. Gossip and community. Villages were tight-knit. Everyone knew everyone's business. Marriages, quarrels, births, all common knowledge. Gossip flowed by the well, by the bakehouse, in the fields. Festivals broke the monotony, dancing on feast days, drinking at the tavern, church bells marking time from baptism to burial. Joy wasn't absent, it just came in small doses. Health and hardship. Illness was constant. Coughs, fevers, wounds that festered. Herbal remedies helped sometimes. Superstition filled the gaps. Few saw doctors. Many trusted midwives, wise women, or charms whispered at night. Childbirth was risky. Death was common for mothers and infants both. Yet families were large because life demanded hands for work. Loss was part of the rhythm, mourned but not unexpected. The emotional landscape. It's tempting to picture medieval peasants as only weary, bent over fields, but they laughed too, sang songs, played games with dice or sticks, told stories by the fire. Children invented mischief, adults told tales of saints and heroes. Life was hard, yes, but not joyless. Love existed, quarrels existed. Humor, sarcasm, tenderness, all the same emotions we carry now, lived inside those smoky huts, just compressed into smaller spaces under heavier burdens. The village heartbeat. Daily life was repetitive, but that repetition gave comfort. Morning bells, evening fire, bread in the pot, gossip at the well, a rhythm like the farming year, steady and slow. And maybe that's why villages endured, not because life was easy, but because it was shared. No one survived alone. A sick neighbor's cow might be milked by another family, tools borrowed, roofs patched, children raised in groups. Life was communal by necessity, not choice, and that necessity bound people tighter than most kings' laws ever could. So as you drift now, picture it, a smoky hut, bread baking in the ashes, children chasing chickens outside. A mother spinning wool, a father patching a plow, a grandmother muttering a prayer. Nothing grand, nothing famous, just life. Ordinary, unchanging, endlessly repeated. And next we'll move into something that shaped this life from the outside, the role of the lord and manor system. Because as free as the village looked, peasants weren't truly free. The manor's shadow stretched across every furrow, every loaf, every life.